Welcome, everyone, to the C-Suite Sales and Marketing Perspective Podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today we've got a really interesting conversation with Valeria Balaro. And Valeria, you're a Chief Marketing Officer at Star. And Star is the way you described it, and I'm going to ask you to expand a little bit more, is an AI native technology consulting firm. And we're going to talk about AI in ways today. It's such a popular conversation, right, to have on podcasts and things like that. But we're going to really talk about how, in the right ways, it's putting pressure on the C-suite. On the right ways, it's having us rethink how we bring in talent and we nurture talent, how we develop value for our clients. It's not just about we're doing things more efficiently, right? Which is amazing. And that's a big, big part of it. But if you wouldn't mind explaining a little bit more about your background before we get started.
Sure. Hi, Steve. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. It's very exciting to be having the conversation with you here today. To share a little bit about Star and myself. As you mentioned, I'm CMO at Star. Star is about 1,000 people strong technology consulting firm. We call ourselves AI native technology consulting. And what that means essentially is that we support our clients across a number of industries like automotive, health, media, finance, with product platform development, digital transformation, and we do it in an AI native way. That means that the way we create technology, the way we create code, the way we design is AI native. So our designers and engineers, they are using AI in the development process. They are also advising our clients on the use of AI. We have a very strong regulatory consulting practice as well that helps our clients develop AI solutions that are going to fit within the regulations and be approved and be ethical. We're focusing very strongly on that element. And of course, we have been around for about 18 years and we were not always AI native because that did not exist. In the last sort of 2-3 years, we have made that shift. And really, it's changing the whole physics of delivery. So if, for example, in the past, we could take 2 weeks to create a proof of concept, that's something that can be done in a day or in a couple of hours now. So we have sometimes projects where AI writes all the code and, humans just check it, etc. So the way companies like ours are able to work now is completely changing. So that's why I'm here to talk about it. It's very exciting.
I love that. It's changing the way companies are thinking of growing. Like you talked about, the growth rules are being rewritten, right? How we compete, how we create value for our clients, and in the time frame that they expect it. If you could just kind of break it down and say, how do you think the growth rules are being rewritten today? And what do we need to know about that?
Yeah, so I think growth rules, how a company grows is changing completely. And, AI is accelerating it greatly. And I mean, it is equally exciting and terrifying because, on one hand, you are able to automate so much and do things so much faster. On the other hand, if you don't have really good human judgment, then you could be taking bad decisions really, really quickly. So it's an accelerator, but an accelerator can go both ways into the positive and into the negative. I think it's forcing every company to answer what part of the value that we create is coming from the craft and what is just the labor. And I think that's kind of, important difference because you need to understand what do we have to double down on and we could never eliminate. And we need to make sure that we hone that into a unique differentiator, competitive advantage. And what can we afford to just automate, which, what of it is just repetitive tasks, labor that can be taken on by machines effectively. So that forces people to think about their companies differently and really, really understand why is it people buy you? Why do they choose you over your competitors? And double down on those things.
So what you just said there, why do people buy from us? Why do they see us as different and better than our competitors? And in the world of B2B, and Forrester said it really well, that content's the foundation, right? It's our entry point, it's our handshake, it's our introduction, it's what demonstrates our value, what communicates our advantages. But you talk about, and this was one of the first areas of AI that saw a lot of disruption, right? Was content. And then just the explosion of noise that came out. And, you've been working so long now in AI in working with companies. And as a CMO, you know the importance of content. And so what's your perspective on this, right? Like, how do we stand out when everybody can create content that looks pretty good, sounds pretty good these days?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, content is, it's our fuel, right? As a marketer, especially as a B2B marketer, that is the key thing that we produce. So it is very important. So, and people say AI is the great equalizer, and it is. It's absolutely true. But what that means is that everybody across the world, whoever has access to a mobile phone, can create content, right? And they all have access to the same tools. So they can create content of the same level of quality as each other, regardless of your experience, etc. So that equalizer element has a dark side, and the dark side is the fact that it can create a sea of sameness. And, it's basically, I would say that the easier it becomes to create content, the more valuable good content becomes. And of course, there is a difference between, really bad, lazy prompting that would create just this slop, as we call it, and, advanced, thoughtful prompting where people really understand how they need to create content using AI, etc. But even so, I would say that what differentiates us is the original thought, is the ability to have a differentiated, unique point of view. At Star, we use AI to create content, but we never use it to create thought leadership. And the key difference here is that for thought leadership, we want to have that expert view, that thinking from our specialists who have, years and years of experience. But then we can take that and, translate it into 5 blog posts and 3 articles and social media posts, etc. But you need to have a base that is based on the real, true human differentiated thinking that comes from experience and judgment. For example, I am a Forbes contributor and I write sometimes articles for Forbes, and those take me hours to write. And because I'm synthesizing my experience, I'm trying to find something unique about the way how I think rather than just generating tasks through AI. And I think that's the kind of content that is useful and that is valuable, not because it's like perfectly optimized for search, but it's genuinely mine. It translates my thoughts. And so I think that's, the edge that the AI cannot replicate. So yeah, I think if you want to stand out, have something worth saying, and that authentic thought is going to be more valuable than ever.
Another way to interpret what you just said is because AI is forcing us, disrupting us. AI is forcing us to do what we should always have done before, anyways. The strategy that you just talked about, real, authentic, expert point of view, founded in the voice of the customer, their pain points, their challenges. That has always been our strategy, right? What AI has done is it's allowed us to sound a lot smarter without having to do that deep work, having to have that unique point of view, right? It's like, wow, that was really good. Look at that. Let's just put that out. But we don't talk about AI as reinforcing the fundamentals of what it's needed to differentiate, to create a competitive advantage, to establish ourselves like a Gartner, Forrester, like trusted advisor, right? That was my takeaway from what you were just saying there is we got to double down on the things that we know make us successful, that know differentiate us, right? That we know will build trust in the marketplace behind our voice. So thank you. I think that's a very different perspective than most people talk about AI, and I appreciate it. You talked about how AI is changing how you develop talent internally. And I love to say here, but I've never explored it from this perspective. PE firms, venture capital firms, they invest in the talent first. the idea second. That's how important. High performing teams are what create growth, right? You could have phenomenal idea. If we don't have the team to execute it, it's not going to happen. So how do you think about AI and talent and how we have to develop and think about talent differently today?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Steve, because, another question I get asked a lot too often is, with AI being there, do we need as many people? Do we need juniors? Right. So it's, how AI is changing that equation of what are people actually doing in the work, and how do they grow, and how do they grow that expertise and that unique voice and that experience. And I think it's one of the darker sides of AI, I think, is that so much of the work that typically was done by juniors can be automated. And of course, it's great for cost savings, but we are essentially now creating a vacuum in which, people who are young, who don't have experience or a unique point of view yet, but have to develop one, they don't have an opportunity to do so. And at some point, they will have to progress in their careers. They will have to become managers. Let's say, they have mastered AI, they have started using it, maybe somehow indiscriminately, but they're getting away with it and they're becoming managers, but they have never learned to be practitioners. So, what kind of managers can they be, right? You need the judgment. And I'm always going back to this like judgment. There was time where judgment was a bit of like a negative word. I feel it's never been more positive than now. You need to have judgment. And that comes only through trying something repeatedly and failing, because you write like a headline, you get it bad, you do something wrong, your boss gives you bad feedback, you feel really ashamed. That's where learning happens, right? That feeling of like, I really messed it up. I don't want to feel like that again. That's how you learn what's good and what's not good. So you need to go through that before you're able to develop the instinct for what is actually good. What does that look like? And so, if AI is writing those things, creating those headlines, doing the job that the junior person would have done before, and it's doing kind of an okay job, and where is that exposure that can create judgment for the person, right? So everything is kind of okay, but how do you learn what separates okay from great or okay from not so okay? So yeah, you're maybe learning to edit, but you're not really learning to create. And I think, that's a real risk for the young people in the workplace. But another thing that I have noticed is that also, some senior people are using AI also indiscriminately. And that is a bigger problem and a less forgivable one. Because I think, you can tell. And especially when, a senior person outsources somewhat strategic decisions to AI, and you can tell. And I think that is, something that can erode a lot of trust really quickly in the senior people as well. So I think you just have to be really careful, really deliberate. Obviously, you should not avoid using AI, but you need to build that judgment and you need to always exercise that judgment.
So exercising that judgment is obviously, it's a lot more than content creation. And you talked about that the role of the CMO is actually growing and how it infiltrates really the entire organization. And here's why this is important. I talk to a lot of CMOs. I talk to a lot of CMOs that have imposter syndrome, that don't feel like they have a seat at the table, that feel like they're as good as the last lead that they brought into the organization, that they're on top of one of the biggest cost centers in the organization. So therefore, they feel kind of like they're the CMO on the bubble, right? And we're the shortest tenure in the C-suite. So the CMO role needs purpose in a way that it has never had it before. And when we talked, I thought, oh my goodness, everybody's got to hear this. So you talked about how the CMO role has to influence things like systems and revenue and operations. And we've never talked that way before. So I would love to hear your vision the CMO role and how it's changing.
Yeah. So you touched on something that's absolutely true and has a big frustration for every CMO is that being as good as the last lead you brought in or being seen as a cost center rather than a revenue generator, or even, in many companies, you don't have the systems, the ability to attribute the success that marketing has created. So I think that is big issue with our role because on one hand, marketing can and does influence revenue and create revenue quite directly. But at the same time, it does so much more than that, right? And some things that you cannot quantify. So how do you quantify brand? I mean, there are some methodologies that people use, but realistically, when you have your CFO at the table, then he doesn't necessarily want to hear about brand equity and what that means. He wants to know how much money you're spending and how much money you're bringing in, right? So I think that's really, really key. And more than ever now, marketing is seen as a revenue generator function, and there is an expectation that you have to show ROI. So at Star, I run both marketing and new business development. So the BDR team is a part of the marketing organization, which it would have been an unusual combination a couple of years ago. But now, there's more and more teams that are structured this way because marketing does not stop at lead generation. At Star, marketing contributes between 30 and 60% of pipeline, of net new pipeline. And we track our contribution all the way down to revenue, right? So we know that attribution is really strict and we are showing that on a quarterly basis. That is the expectation of CMOs and of the marketing teams. Nobody cares about leads anymore, right? You need to show revenue. And so I think, when you said that CMO is becoming this orchestrator of systems, yes, 100%, because to be able to show that, you need to have influence on what is the technology that your company has, what systems do you have to be able to show that attribution all the way from the lead from your website down to revenue. You need to have good customer data. Again, that's a kind of a decision that is jointly owned with the CTO. You need to have oversight or good collaboration with revenue operations, with product experience, etc. Marketing is sitting in the center of all of these functions, and it's really exposed to all of them because if you don't have access or if you don't have influence over one of these areas, then you're not going to be able to create a true revenue generating function because you need all of these little pieces of puzzle to work together. And as I mentioned, revenue is a part of the story. It's a part of the bigger story, but one that you cannot always tell easily, or people are not always interested to hear. But so I see it as, brand and pipeline being part of one story. It's not two separate issues. We need to weave them together and show how they are influencing what we do and helping the company grow from different angles. So I think, we need to reframe how we evaluate the CMO's effectiveness and not look at, as a CMO, not ask yourself the question, how can I get credit for the marketing contribution? But, rather, what is it that I can influence? How can I influence growth of this company? And some of this influence will come through, traditionally brand activities. Some of these influence will come through traditionally performance-based activities. But so at Star, we always measure pipeline, we always measure revenue, but also since last year, we have started measuring influence. And that's, I'm still showing it alongside the other metrics to the board because I want them to get used to it and to understand what that means before that becoming the primary metric. But I'm really convinced that is the most important thing we can show. How does marketing influence rather than, only focusing on pipeline?
So much to unpack there. I love that your marketing attribution, extraordinarily important. But the more and more we say, look at the 5 touch points we had, therefore we had huge influence, right? It's becoming less meaningless just to show just attribution numbers. And what the organization wants and what it needs is for marketing to not be just part of a baton pass. We created the lead, we had these touch points. There you go. It's yours, sales, take it, right? That we need to and are expected to take part all the way through, not even just the close of the deal, right? But there's customer marketing, right? NRR is really important and how we retain customers. And so I love your perspective that we're more involved. We're at the center of all of this as an ecosystem. So my question is, how do you show influence? And how do you actually not only show it, but how do you activate it inside the organization?
Yes, so that's a really good question. That's back to the systems, right? Because you cannot just show it as easily if you don't have the systems in place. So, for example, at Star, we started using demand base, and that has been really, really helpful to show the influence side of things because we can see all of the touch points, as you mentioned, that it takes to close a deal. So we operate within quite high value deals, right? So our sales cycles are very, very long. We need to have tens of touch points. We need to engage buying committees of, 10, 12, 16 people. So it's a complex process to sell something at Star. So having that visibility is really, really important. And having some really clear rules, okay, with attribution, you always have to, because otherwise you end up with meaningless data. So you need to have really strict rules about what is the time period we're going to look at, which activities are we going to consider, marketing versus sales, how are we going to assign different weights to the different activities, etc. So sort of we measure it in that way. We measure all the touch points and we see which ones of those have been meaningful. And then we will say, okay, this was a meaningful touch point. For example, person didn't just like read an article on the website, but they have taken an action, right? They have joined the webinar. They've given us some of their time. They've come to an event. They've engaged in they've asked a question during a webinar, something like that. So we want them to have taken an action and to really engage with us. And then we measure all of this engagement and we're like, yes, this was a meaningful touch point. So I think to be able to do that, you need to really focus on your buyer's journey. How does your buyer buy? And really understand that, what is it that needs to happen for them? So you need to take quite like an empathetic point of view from your buyers through your buyer's eyes. And I really like this phrase, and I don't know where I've heard it. It's not mine, but I don't know who to attribute it to. But it said as marketers, our job is not to sell, it's to help buyers buy. And I really love that because you cannot be a good marketer if you don't understand how your buyer buys. So I think understanding the journey, understanding where the different touch points in the journey that we can influence, or that we can make meaningful so that they remember us, even if they're not ready to buy yet. How do we track that over time? How do we make sure there's continuity? So yeah, having that journey really mapped out and having good understanding what happens at every stage, that's how we can influence.
So what you just said there, how do we help at every stage? I think as marketers, we need to be thinking more about every stage. And here's an example. This was a Forrester stat. 86% of B2B deals stall at some point. Right. So we tend to have inside of our own organizations, get us into the conversation with the right people. And we're going to close our fair share. Right. Our thinking should be that's going to be one son of a gun to close. Right. We're going to work hard. It's going to feel like it's lost, like it's one step out the door. We're going to have to resuscitate. That should be our mentality. Right. And so that's very late stage deals. Right. And the later the stage of the deal, typically the less involved marketing can be. But those are some of the places where marketing or product or conversations with other executives in the company really go a long way. It's just one example. What would be your suggestion or just your point of view for how CMOs can stay involved, right? And not have influence really start to wane as the deal progresses, because that's not what our board wants. That's not what our CEO wants. That's not what our CRO wants, right? We all need to be working as a team all the way through. So when you started talking about influence and involved at all stages, I just think that we're, as an industry, as CMOs, we're not as good. Like the longer it goes, the more we're reliant on somebody else to be really taking the ball and running with it.
Yeah, I think the difference here is how do you measure success? And if you measure success through the number of leads that you have delivered, you have no incentive to stay connected to the later stages of the buying process, right? If you're like, oh, we've delivered 1,000 leads this time, they're hot leads, great, off you go, guys, we've done our job, pat ourselves on the back. That's, yeah. And then we get that friction between sales and marketing because sales will like, these were not good quality leads and, they're not doing it. You know the story, right? So I think we need to reward right behavior with right metrics. So when I set the OKRs for my team, there is no OKR about leads. There is nothing leads in there. There's nothing about MQLs. There's nothing about SQLs. Nothing. We have OKRs around pipeline and revenue. And if you're as a marketer, you cannot open pipeline, right? You cannot close a deal as a marketer, right? That needs to be done by sales. So we need to put in place processes and rituals that allow us to be involved at all of those stages and not just at a stage of here we go, here's a lead, we're washing our hands now. And so when the team is incentivized based on revenue and pipeline, they are very much interested to make sure that, the meeting takes place. There's a follow-up, that they have shared something and have you invited them to our webinar and have you shared this new thought leadership, et cetera, et cetera. So the team is actively working with the sales team and reminding them to do the different touch points and reminding them that, we have this really relevant piece of content that has just come out that is going to be relevant to this client because we know they've been engaging on our website with similar content, right? So we are constantly following this because, we have these high value clients or high value prospects. So we are following them personally and we are looking, where can we add value to them so that we can help progress their deal through the pipeline. And I think, too many times marketing is focused on top of the funnel and not enough on the whole funnel, right? So, and also too frequently marketing is only focused on new business and not on existing clients. So I think, we constantly at every stage of the funnel have to prove that we are credible, that we are the right partner, that we are relevant, we really understand them, we speak their language. We just need to do that continuously, even after they buy.
I have to tell you, you just had my number one takeaway from everything that we've talked about here. And I was writing it down and I'm going to have to go back and listen to it again. But you said, we have to be personally following these opportunities. And we have to be thinking about at every stage, am I sharing? Am I re-engaging? Is the meeting happening? Right? The picture that I got was, I remember as kids, like we do like the 3-legged race, right? Where you tie one leg together, you'd have to like work in unison together, right? What I took away is you working in unison with sales in a way that is atypical from the way we've done it. The being so involved, right? I just love the way that you articulated that. And so I'd love to now ask you one last question. That was my takeaway, whole takeaway from this conversation. If you had one thing that you wanted anyone that's going to be consuming this podcast to take away, the C-suite executives that are going to be watching this podcast, what's the one most important thing that you would want them to remember?
Don't underestimate marketing and marketing's importance. And that's to the point that you made earlier that so many marketers feel like imposters. They don't have a seat at the table. I think too many companies make marketers feel like that. They see marketing as this kind of a nice to have department that can do some fun things, but is not really generating business. It's more like a support function. And I mean, in many cases it is, but I don't think that's just the fault of the marketers. I think it's a combined situation. I think marketing can be an incredibly effective channel for revenue generation. but it needs alignment on the board level, on this most senior level of the organization. You need to have the trust of your CEO, of your CTO, of your CFO. You need to have really strong collaboration with the sales team. You need to be there and you need to understand their life and their point of view and how difficult it is to go and speak to clients or with people that you've never met and to pitch and to try to sell to people who don't want to be sold to. Like you need to have empathy for those people and how difficult their jobs are and to understand how you can make it easier for them. So I think really see marketing as a revenue generating function and demand that from your marketers. If you are a CEO, demand that from your marketing department that you need to show me how you generate revenue. And that will force your marketing team to, if they're not doing it yet, to create a deeper collaboration with sales, to understand revenue operations, to understand product better. If they're going to be measured on pipeline and revenue, they're going to find a way to do that. So, yeah, I would say don't treat marketing as a support function.
I wish we had another 2 hours because this is fascinating. And I just want to say thank you because the mission of this podcast is to bring different C suite perspectives, experiences, insights, solutions, failures together. And let's share and let's learn. If we can do that, that's the rising tide that lifts all boats. And you were a phenomenal part of that rising tide today. And I just want to say thank you for coming on today.
Thank you, Steve. I really enjoyed it and really enjoyed our chat. So thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this.